Hello everyone, Jazzy is back with a Kingdom Hearts theory video. Just the other night, KH Insider released the final 3 cutscenes for Kingdom Hearts Union Cross. In these 3 cutscenes, we are shown conversations between the 7 Kingdom Hearts Union Cross characters in the data world, while also a conversation between Luxu and a darkness in the real world. In the first cutscene, we learn that the darkness that Ven was fighting at the end of the previous cutscene is, of course, the one that's still inside him and stays with him throughout the series. At this point, Lauriam is watching over Ven, who is incapacitated and is resting. And interestingly enough, we see him interact with what seems to be a data version of his sister Strelitzia. At the same time, we see Ephemer and Skald communicating with Arena, who reveals that her Chirithy cited Strelitzia with either Luxu or the Master of Masters, someone in a black robe, so those two would fit the description. And of course, they relay this information to Lauriam, and which leads to a discussion with Brain about the data world, showing visions of other people's situations essentially they were involved in, and it is because their data is being accessed by somebody in the real world. Now he also proposes that since they're in the data world, they should also see their own data here, but they have not. So of course the main line being from this scene is that he says that this data may have not been accessed yet and that it's probably locked away somewhere. So of course, this will definitely be a major point I will touch on later. In the next cutscene, we see the 7 go to the basement where the Ark is and learn that there's only 5 pods that are usable. Of course, one pod was used by Maleficent to go into the real world, while another one was broken during during Lauriam's and Maleficent's fight prior to her departure. So now, of course, comes the decision: who will leave, who will stay? Will they use all 5 pods? Will they not? And we learn that Brain, Lauriam, Elrena, and Ven will leave the data world using the Ark, which leaves 1 pod left. Skald, Ephemer, and the player decide to stay behind in the data world, hoping that they will come and save them in the future. So again, this is a great setup for the future events to come in terms of rescuing these individuals from this data world. And last but not least, the final cutscene is between Luxu and the darkness, and of course the conversation reveals a lot. And so the main things I wanted to point out in this cutscene is that darkness reveals at some point during the Keyblade War before their time, only 6 of the darknesses, which is probably 6 of 13, survived the conflict and woke up in the data world. And now that we know 1 is inside Ven, who has left the data world, and then this one left the data world with Maleficent, there's still 4 darknesses within the data world, now with Ephemer, the player, and Skald. We also see at the end of the scene that Luxu and the darkness are about to battle, so then now begs the question, what is the fate of Luxu and this darkness? And if Brain, Lauriam, Arena, and Ven use 4 of those pods that are left, then who will use the last pod? Seeing that Luxu had placed an individual in that middle pod, be it Strelitzia or Ava, or maybe someone else we're not even aware of. So that's where the cutscenes leaves off. So we can infer some events that will occur based on the fates of these characters in the future, while also still trying to guess what other events will unfold between this time point going into Dark Road, and then even further on, going into the world of Quadratum. So with that said, this video will be a little different, in which I will kind of just go through more so PowerPoint slides, not so much interjection little videos here and there. So I hope, I'll keep you entertained as much, even without the videos in the background. So sit back, relax, and let's dive into theory mode. One of the things that the Master of Masters mentioned when he was communicating with the darkness is that he says when the last pod departs, the world will end. And as we've seen in Kingdom Hearts 3 Final Mix, we do see that one big mural mechanism thing in which we see Daybreak Town go to a place of ruin and then come back as Scala ad Kylum. And so now we're at this point that when all these pods through the arc are departed from the real world, then this world will end. In the discussion of who stays and who goes, we learned that even the darkness didn't read too much into the people that use the pod, and he of course recognizes that there are 5 left. And of course we know that there are 7 people that need the pods, but again, there's only 5 that are available within the data world, and now within the real world, since Luxu sent another person in that middle pod as shown here. When the 7 are trying to decide who stays and who goes, I think it was Scald had said to Brain that he should go back, meaning go to the real world. Having you in the real world will give us the best chance to save the people here. And so it's decided that Ephemer, Scald, and the player will stay behind in the data world with the hopes that Brain or the others in combination will come back and rescue them. So Brain, Ven, Elrena, and Lorium will depart on 4 of the 5 pods that are available. Brain, he leaves the Book of Prophecies and his Keyblade that we all know as Master Ericus' Keyblade with them, and these will probably act as a waypoint so they can be reached from the real world in the future. Again, as I had mentioned in introduction, that there are 4 of the darknesses in the data world. There's one inside Ven, and the other one is currently about to battle Luxu in the real world. So there's these 6 darknesses total that again survived. So at this point I'm thinking, will they encounter Missing Road characters? Is this what the setup is? Because of course we know Ericus, he does get this Keyblade, so it would seem that maybe Xehanort and Ericus found a way to the data world and will eventually rescue them. We also see in Kingdom Hearts Dark Road that Xehanort is shown visions of the player, Ephemer, and Scald, and this is probably explains the reason why he's seeing these 3 specifically, in that they're kind of calling out to him in terms of them needing to be rescued. So with those 4 departing and the 3 remaining, now we're on to the situation going on in the real world, in which again now we still only have 5 pods that can be used. Of course, there's only 4 individuals, so it would be safe to assume that all 4 will go into the future to their respective points in time, and that Brain, he will begin Scala ad Kylum after the world ends. So again, as the pods depart, as the last one departs, this world will end, so you get that state in the world of ruin. And I would think Brain would still use a pod to go into the future of that point and start Scala ad Kylum. And as we know, when you see Scala ad Kylum, you kind of have upside down, underwater Daybreak Town. We know Ven will continue on to the future and be involved with Master Xehanort and Terra and Aqua, and of course Vanitas, since he is carrying that darkness with him. And then Lorium and Arena will end up in Organization 13 and become the Nobody's Marluxia and Larxene. So that seems pretty straightforward, but then it does beg the question that if the world is ruined, did Brain, did he or did he not actually use the pod? Did he actually stay and see the world come to ruin and actually build it up from that point, or does he actually jump into the future and then kind of build it from there? So that's also something to think about, in case there's some type of weird twist in terms of who were the actual 7 people that use these pods. Another interesting thing to point out within Lushu and the Darkness's conversation, again, is that the Darkness said he didn't read the part in the book in terms of the people who departed, and that they weren't he wasn't as interested in those individuals as he was of the people who are being stuck in the data world, the sense of the people that got left behind. So obviously this would suggest that Darkness has a plan of its own, and of course knowing that there are 4 other ones still stuck in the data world with them, that type of situation will come into play probably in Kingdom Hearts Dark Road. So I feel like that's where it's going. And of course we still have the unknown whereabouts of Ava and Strelitzia, who have their own roles to play, and still trying to figure out which one was put into the pod. Specifically about Lushu, maybe both of them used the pod. I'm still not entirely sure what is Ava's situation, where she is. Again, she wasn't at the end of Kingdom Hearts 3. Lushu said she had a task of her own and she carried it out, so I don't know if there's a direct link between this situation or something coming up, but it's still something to think about in terms of if both are just one of the two, or maybe even neither, ended up using a pod. But I feel that Ava and Strelitzia probably both used one of these pods. Because again, there is technically still one left, since there's only 4 that came out of the data world, and there's 5 pods remaining. We do learn from the cutscene again that someone had accessed Strelitzia's data, and she is shown walking with an individual in a black coat, which again could be the Master Masters or could be Lushu. So this could be that event that directly led to Lushu placing Strelitzia inside the pod and sending her off and calling her True Dandelion. Or it could suggest that Strelitzia maybe interacted with the Master of Masters, and maybe he had a whole different setup and plan for her, because again, she was slain by Ven, so I guess she's a nobody at this point, or some type of ethereal figure, I guess. Like, I don't know what to call her at this point. She's like a white robed nobody, something like that, I guess. But essentially she's a being walking around without a heart, right? And so maybe the Master Masters put her on the pods himself, or maybe he directly just took her out of this world, and either data world or talking about in the real world, wherever she was, whatever the situation occurred, that he may have directly had a hand in transporting Strelitzia to the future. And it seems like she's still connected through her brother in a nobody type of form that we see in Kingdom Hearts Chain of Memories. If that's the case, so if it's Strelitsia's last pod or was bought through some other way, then that would suggest that probably Ava then was put into that middle pod by Lushu, and she was sent to the future. So I'm still hoping that Ava is connected to Hikari, whether they share a heart or she's her grandmother or something. I mean, I'll give her a really, really prominent role, because again, Hikari's grandmother, she's very, very knowledgeable about the whole Keyblade Wars, so I feel like she was probably there. Or maybe she's a grandchild of one of the original ones too, who knows. They got a whole bunch of time hopping and switching and stuff, so but whatever the case, if Ava is the True Dandelion, which for me would make sense since she's the ones that brought the dandelions together, then she would be the one that was placed into that pod. And there's one other point I wanted to touch on, is just kind of trying to like wrap my head around the Master Masters mentioning like 7 crowns and 7 lights who will travel into the future with him. And this was in a cutscene from the last update, and for me, I think based on the context of what he was talking about at the time, it would seem that the Master Masters were referring to the people that will follow him into the future beyond the Book of Prophecies, of course the world that he couldn't even conceive, which is him referring to Quadratum. So of course initially I thought the 7 crowns or 7 lights, which is still, this is still part of the equation, is of course the 7 Union Cross characters, but now I feel like it may be a mixture in terms of which ones actually end up traveling to Quadratum, into this future that the Master of Masters is referencing when he's talking to a darkness. So yeah, so that's kind of a point to just keep in mind as I go in terms of, again, elaborating on the direction the series will go in the future. With that said, there's always an alternative to situations like these, because again, they're not directly stating that yes, Skald, Ven, Arena, and Laurium all will leave the real world and go into the future point of the real world. So again, you have the situation where you have these 5 pods and you're still trying to figure out who's going to use them all. So I think Laurium, Arena, and Ven are pretty set. And of course Ven, knowing that Ven has darkness with him, that he's also carrying his darkness into the future. And based on the cutscene between Lushu and the one darkness in the real world, Lushu was getting frustrated because he was saying that no matter what point in time he goes to, the darkness will always be there. And I think that's probably referencing the darkness that's inside Ven, but also it could be referencing how maybe even this darkness that he's battling right now will end up using one of the pods. Maybe he'll sneak in and possess like Brain or somebody. And then they will end up going to the future, and then now you have these 2 darknesses in the future. Or maybe he might even hide within Lushu. And now for Lushu, if I'm not mistaken, the Master Masters told him that the world goes to ruin to hijack it, hightail it out of there through like a corridor or something. So I'm not entirely sure if he would use a pod or not. So that's why I'm still debating if, again, who's using these pods and who's not. So maybe darkness takes the pod, maybe darkness possesses one of them and takes, goes in the pod with them to the future. Or again, the situation where Celestia and Ava are using these pods, and then, it's just the basics. Celestia, Ava, Brain, Ven, Laurium, and Arena going to the future using the pods. But again, this is something to think about. But I would feel that if there's only 6 remaining and 4 stuck in the data world, that the 2 that are in the real world right now before the ruined world will probably make it into the future. So that's just my gut feeling in terms of the pod situation in the real world. To wrap up this whole pod situation, now let's go back into the data world, in which we still have a situation with there's 1 pod left, and then there's also the broken one in the middle of the room. Now, with their friends departing and these 3 individuals being stuck in the data world, they're going to have a lot of time being there until someone can come back and rescue them. So I would think that the 3 can put their brains together and probably fix the middle pod that was broken during Laurium and Maleficent's fight. And with this, maybe there is a situation that will occur in terms of battling with the 4 darknesses that remain in the data world, and that Ephemer maybe will kind of sacrifice himself and let the other 2 friends escape, in which, again, I believe that the player is Demix, and so the player will use one of the pods and escape to the future. And if that's not the case, if the pod's not fixed, or if the player's not Demix or whatever, maybe the player is somebody else. Of course, people are suggesting maybe Luxord as well. But whoever the player may be, I would think that they would escape the data world and then go into the future. But if he doesn't escape, she doesn't escape, I guess the player is supposed to be a guy, but whatever. If she doesn't escape, then the player may remain in the data world with Ephemer. Of course, everything is suggesting that Subject X is Skald, and then this would suggest that Skald would end up using the last pod that's, fully functional, and she would end up in Radiant Garden. So I would think this would be at some point. Of course, she would use the pod after the real world's ruined, or the end of the real world, before Scarlet Kylo, everything comes back, however you want to say it. So when she uses the pod, it'll be at the point where all those other worlds are opened up, created. So you have Radiant Garden, you have Destiny Island, you have all these other worlds and whatnot. So then Skull will end up in Radiant Garden, and as we learn from the secret reports that Aussie remembers, is 4 friends and a key. So for me, obviously she had 6 other friends, so she's not remembering 2 of them. So then that may be more of a suggestion that the player and Ephemer remain trapped in the data world because she doesn't remember them. But for whatever reason, though, it's weird because then she says she remembers a key, which is the key that was left, which is probably the Keyblade that was left with Ephemer, which is Master Ericus's Keyblade. So then that, that kind of complicates things. But for whatever reason, she only remembers 4 out of her 6 friends and the Keyblade. Maybe during all this, again, we have this whole conflict between them fighting the 4 remaining darknesses here. Maybe they'll escape, either through the signals in Data World or someone coming to rescue them may accidentally release them into the real world. And so that kind of, for me, would segue over into Kingdom Hearts Dark Road, in which we know that Xehanort will side with the darkness, and so maybe he will purposely or accidentally release these 4 darknesses from the data world into the real world. And for me, make a lot of sense, because then maybe this is associated with the situation of the 4 graves that we were introduced to, and how Xehanort feels guilty about whoever death he has caused. And so we have 4 darknesses, we have 4 graves, so maybe that's that association. And again, that's why he feels guilty, because he was the one directly involved in the situation. We know that the Keyblade that was left with Ephemer will end up as Master Ericus's Keyblade, so then it would suggest that Xehanort and Ericus found these 3 stuck in the data world and, rescued them, brought them back, did whatever, but they probably, freed the 3 individuals, or if Scald had already left prior to, then they were at least able to release Ephemer and the player. And so that would be a really interesting situation to see the fates of the 3 that stayed behind in the data world. Because of course we've seen Ephemer and the Keyblade Graveyard interact with Sora. Again, we're suggesting that Subject X is Scald, and that the player may be Demix, so I would hope that would be confirmed. And I hope that's the situation that's going on. But for me, that would make the most sense in terms of how Ericus got the Keyblade, and kind of bring in more depth to Xehanort and his whole situation in dealing with the darkness and his feelings of guilt towards the situation of the 4 deaths of either his classmates on his level or his upper classmates, but I'm thinking it's probably the 4 other classmates that are not Baldair. So that's what I think what's going on with this situation is giving a nice segue into Kingdom Hearts Dark Road, and so I feel like the cutscenes from that game will pick up right where Kingdom Hearts Union Cross left off. To summarize my thoughts on the whole situation and how this could all end up, I kind of present here the 6 darknesses that remained after, I guess, the first part, or after at some point of the Keyblade War, and which that you have the 1 darkness that's inside Vin that we know will manifest as Vanitas. We have a darkness that is battling Lushu that says that his goal is to accompany the Chosen One to the future, so they can they or whoever he's referencing, I don't know if it's his entity specifically or just again as a whole as a darkness, is that they want to lay claim to worlds not yet created. And of course Lushu's frustration saying, so no matter what world I'm in, you'll end up being there too. And that Lushu has his own plan in terms of dealing with the darkness of them not getting in his way as he's trying to journey into the future and complete his task of essentially just carrying the Master's Keyblade into the future so he can see everything that's going on, right? So that was his task. And now we have a situation where there's 4 darknesses in the data world with 3 people, but then if we do have Rain kind of will maybe kind of be like that bridge between the data world and the real world. He could be counted as another individual that may have to deal with these 4 darknesses in the data world. I mean, obviously you can swap out Brain for Ericus or Xehanort, if that's the situation. But if these 4 darknesses are connected to these 4 individuals, again, that would kind of segue more into my theory in terms of the fate of Scald, Brain, Ephemer, and the player, and how their characters will carry over to Quadratum. And since Lucio had mentioned that the darkness will end up in whatever time or whatever world he is in, that maybe these darknesses follow these 4 individuals to Quadratum, to this fictional world. So that's what I'm just kind of playing around with here, kind of summarizing. But again, the 4 darknesses may just be connected to the deaths of Xehanort and Ericus's 4 friends. But I feel like they will have a bigger role. One of the main pieces of information that was revealed in the cutscene between the 7 characters in Union Cross and the data world, that of course I would love to expand ideas on and discuss, is when Brain says, besides, if everyone's data was brought over again to Data Daybreak Town, shouldn't there be version of us here too? So Brain specifically mentioning that the data is locked up and hasn't been touched yet. Where would this data be locked away into? And of course, the ongoing discussion of what is in this black box. I think we finally were given an answer. And it may even be more than what he's even suggesting, which is what I'm proposing in this slide. And so, of course, previously we described the black box of having this inscription called Key Superbia, which equals pride, which is probably associated with the Master of Masters, again, because all the apprentices' names are derivative of the 7 deadly sins. Where, again, I was feeling like whatever's in this black box is directly linked to the way to end the Keyblade War, and then also a way to access Kingdom Hearts, bringing together the light and darkness, so you can summon Kingdom Hearts or recomplete the Keyblade as we see at the end of Kingdom Hearts 3. So it would seem that what's in this black box is that the data of the people that are missing from this Data Daybreak Town is stored within this black box. And so, of course, this data could be these 7, I guess you can call them crowns, 7 lights, these 7 individuals that preserve the light for the future. And then again, seeing that their data is stored here, this could explain why there may be versions of themselves in this real world, and then also the fictional world, which is of course what I'll expand on in the next slide when I start discussing Quadratum. It's also, again, a theory I've always presented in a lot of my videos prior to this one. Knowing this information that their data is stored into this box, that means someone can access it, and someone can use this data essentially for other purposes, or kind of copy this data onto somebody else, is the main idea there. Since repeatedly the characters were saying that the Masters and that the Master of Masters are not in this data world, so that would suggest that their data is also probably stored in the block in the box as well. And so for this, again, this is this idea that the Master of Master, his data is actually copied onto Sora, and that the other apprentice's data is copied onto the other 7 of lights that are around during Sora's time. Now, of course, with this idea, it'll be interesting if, because I don't think technically Lucio was ever in the data world, but again, still with the 7 lights, since Mickey is technically one of them, I don't see that connect between like Mickey and Lucio. So that might be, something that would be played around with in terms of if Lucio's data is in this box or not. So that's something also to keep in mind. And then, of course, thinking back to the cutscenes, we have the situation where the darkness said that 6 of them survived the conflict. So if there is the 13 darknesses, like there's supposed to be 13 pieces of darkness and 7 pieces of light, then that would mean 7 of them were defeated, and maybe their data or being or whatever form they were at that time is stored into this box as well. Some type of situation that we kind of see, with Ven and Vanitas, or the darkness or whatever, that the light and the darkness can kind of form into one person, or it could be stored inside one person, right? And so it'd be interesting if the darknesses that were defeated were kind of absorbed into Master of Masters and his apprentices, and then that, I guess, that data or whatever is stored inside this box. So in summary, the box will have the data of the 7 individuals in the data world, have the data of the 7 of Masters and his apprentices, those 7, and then also the 7 darknesses that were defeated, in which the 7 lights and 7 darknesses may be sharing a being or whatever. And again, this is a kind of important point to a later theory I'll introduce, in terms of, course, going back to the 7 new black chess pieces that on Xehanort's side of the board at the end of Kingdom Hearts 3, and the unknown number of white chess pieces that will come into play on Ericus' side. So again, keep that in mind. And then also another thought I had is that, again, thinking of the Book of Prophecies, obviously there's other copies. There seems to be one that was left in the data roll with Ephemer, and as for now, we don't know the fate of that Book of Prophecies. But maybe the Master of Masters has like a different version of the Book of Prophecies that's also locked away in this box, and maybe in the form of data, maybe the physical book, whatever. But it may contain even more information, maybe from the Master's childhood, so even going back to the beginning of the Keyblade War, or maybe even contains information going into the future world that the Master of Masters had mentioned to the darkness, in terms of talking about a world he couldn't conceive. Again, talking about the fictional world Quadratum. So in summary, this back box probably holds a lot of secrets that need to be unfolded. And hopefully, again, we'll get answers, whether it be some more expansion on characters learning what's in this black box in Dark Road, or even just waiting until we get to the world of Quadratum in future games. So with that said, now we have this nice setup in terms of trying to figure out whose heart replaced Azora, and probably his comrades and her heart as well, in this fictional world that Sora finds himself in now. So for me, I can kind of think of 2 main scenarios that has occurred between the events of Kingdom Hearts Union Cross up into the current place and time we're at now in Kingdom Hearts, at the end of Kingdom Hearts 3. So even though I only show Ephemer, Scald, and Brain here, also keep in mind that the 4th individual will be the player, and I connected him to the comrade with the glasses. And as I had mentioned earlier, these 4 seem to be still connected to the data world at this point in time. But for my scenario 1, I would actually like to believe that their data hearts, so the ones that were in the black box, were used to replace the hearts of Azora and his comrades, and Azora and his comrades' bodies were used as a vessel for their data hearts. And so in this case, you have this this data transfer situation going on. And also in this case, that means that their real selves end up in their respective places in the real world, and that it would make sense that, Skull can be Subject X and all this stuff happening with her, but then her data and her data heart can be in Yozora's world, and it was used to replace these individuals. And it does seem that Lushu did lose the black box for some time. He was searching for it in the form of Ziggy. Zigbar, whatever you want to call him. He was sitting there trying to get other people to search for it with him. How and when he lost the box, I don't know. But that can be an important plot element in terms of if someone accessed their data and started transferring it over into Quadratum. The other situation that I can think of, if the black box was not open, then their real hearts were used to replace the hearts in Quadratum after all these series of events unfold in the real world in Kingdom Hearts. And again, for me, this may be connected to those 4 darkness in the data world or not, and that the darkness might have rid with them out of the data world into this Quadratum world to kind of spread the darkness there. And in this scenario, then the data of these individuals will still be in the black box, and then this may come into play in terms of, actually, I think about it, so maybe that will happen, that the data is preserved in the box, and then when Lucio meets up with the rest of the apprentices, he may use their data to kind of either restore light to themselves or something. Well, I'll think about that a little bit more, but that's also a situation too in terms of preserving this light, and again, the apprentices and the masters chess pieces appearing as being darknesses, so maybe they need to restore their light some type of way, and that might be the purpose of the black box. So that'll be interesting to see if that unfolds or not. In any case, now that we have more information of what's probably in this black box, I can think that this would be a great setup in terms of what is going to happen in Quadratum. Probably the expansion of this darkness and its spread into the fictional world. Maybe directly from the Age of Fairy Tales, these 4 individuals of Skald, Ephraim, and the player being stuck in the data world, and then possibly Brain moving in between or in and out, or whoever he's interacting with. Whatever the case, we have this darkness probably being transferred over to this world that Sorik and Hikari are going to have to face as they interact with these new characters from Quadratum, and of course discovering that individuals that replace their hearts are these individuals from the Age of Fairy Tales. The main thing here is that I think these are actually the 7 crowns that the Master of Masters mentioned when he was talking about the 7 lights, or the 7 crowns that will follow him into the future. And the future he was talking about was Quadratum. I don't think necessarily he was talking about the current state, of Kingdom Hearts 3. I think he was talking about the future after the end of the Keyblade War, which is something he always mentions, like what's going to happen. You already have to plan for what's going to happen after the Keyblade War. So essentially, this whole situation with Age of Fairy Tales, probably Dark Road now, and then of course in Sora's storyline is the setup for what's going to occur in Quadratum, of course. And now these are the 7 individuals, the 7 lights we're going to have to pay attention to moving forward. From a discussion of the future of this universe, now let's think back to the beginnings, going into a discussion on the Lost Masters and their relationship with the Master of Masters. We learned that the Master of Masters said that the Keyblade War started when he was a child, or during his childhood, and that at the time no Masters existed, but there were other Keyblade wielders. And of course, Master Masters being Master Masters said he was the only one that was relevant to the story at the time when he was telling it to Lucio. We also learned that during the chess match between Xehanort and Ericus, when they discuss the Lost Masters, Xehanort mentions that the Lost Masters started the Keyblade War, or were the ones for whom the war started. Having this play on words, you can kind of think of 2 different situations that's going on based off of what he's saying, and then also what the Master of Masters is telling Lucio. It seems like there's 2 different situations occurring that's very evident in this quote. We have one part in which the Keyblade War was started by the Lost Masters, or the Lost Masters were the ones for whom the war started. So going back to the Master's childhood, it would seem that there is 6 other individuals that are probably Keyblade wielders that are connected to him. And for now, I'll have them as placeholders in terms of who these original 7 lights were. But we do know that in his childhood, he faced darkness. What we do know is that during the Master's childhood, darkness took on a form, and it was probably birthed from the darkness of people's hearts. And this started the battle between light and darkness. We also know that the people fought over the light of Kingdom Hearts, and this is what birthed the darkness within their hearts, bringing about this ongoing clash between the light and darkness of his childhood. The result of this clash is that the Keyblade was scattered into 20 pieces, in which you have 13 dark pieces and 7 light pieces. So it would seem that the Master of Masters and 6 others may have been fated to receive these 7 light pieces, while other 13 individuals received the dark pieces. At some point they clashed, and maybe in this instant that the darkness was able to overpower the light, which is something that was introduced in the cutscene from this update, in which we learn that the darkness had to cast aside their form or had to abandon their form in order to defeat the light, and they became a whole. So in this situation, it would seem that the Masters and his comrades, or maybe just his comrades, fell to darkness, and darkness took over for this time. Now, seeing the situation unfold, since Master said he was the only one supposedly relevant to the situation, meaning that he probably is the only one that survived, only one of the lights that survived through the situation, he essentially would set up Daybreak Town, or kind of mingle in their world to provide new lights for the future and have them survive the still ongoing Keyblade War, the war between light and darkness. So now this is where the second part, or I guess technically the first part of the quote comes into play, is that the Lost Masters, now actually referring to the apprentices, started the Keyblade War. This is what we see in Union Cross, in which the Master of Masters plants doubt and begins warring between the unions and, of course, the union leaders, being his apprentices, leading to the eventual downfall of Daybreak Town. And unfortunately, of course, in this situation, the light is not being preserved because we are starting to see that the Master of Masters himself and these 6 apprentices probably also were consumed by darkness at this point. And the Master of Masters, being the Master of Masters, had to find another way to preserve the light. Which brings us to the new group of 7 lights from Kingdom Hearts Union Cross, in which we have the player, Elrena, Brain, Ephemer, Laurium, Scald, and Ven. We are also learning that their data was stored somewhere, and probably, of course, inside this black box. And this is the mechanism the Master Master is using to preserve the light so it can be carried out into the future generations, which will eventually lead to the rise of technically 6 new lights, since Fen is an old light as well, and then the addition of Terra, Aqua, Sora, Hikari, Riku, and Mickey. And so at this point in his plan, you're having this, and throughout this whole entire situation, you're having Kingdom Hearts be in different states of either pure light, a neutral state, or pure darkness, as shown here. And we see this throughout the later installments of Kingdom Hearts, starting with Birth by Sleep, when Master Xehanort summons Kingdom Hearts in the Keyblade Graveyard. We see, although it seems to be an artificial Kingdom Hearts that the Organization 13 is trying to build in Kingdom Hearts 2, that it has a yellow glow to it, which I think is neutral. And then last but not least, we have the Dark Kingdom Hearts that Master Xehanort summons at the end of the Keyblade War. And as a result of the Master's effort to preserve the light and to carry it over into the future, now we have light and probably even darkness in this black box that is being preserved. And what this might lead to is bringing about these 13 darknesses and 7 lights into this fictional world to Quadratum. With the contents of the black box, the Master seems to be trying to bring about the reconstruction of the Keyblade in the fictional world, aka Quadratum, with the main goal of bringing Kingdom Hearts back into their world, be it the fictional world or the real world, and probably in a state of neutrality or mostly light. It would be curious to see how many black pieces in the end there actually is. So far, again, we're seeing 7 black pieces with symbols that represent Masters and his apprentices. Let's not forget we have those darknesses, those 6 other darknesses that could be also still lingering around. We have the one that manifests as Vanitas that was hiding inside Ventus, as shown in the bottom right. And then we also have the darkness that had escaped with Maleficent out of the data world that actually seemed to be interacting with Lucio, but maybe this darkness is hiding within somebody else at this current point in time. So that's also something to keep in mind in terms of, even though they're only presenting 7 black chess pieces right now, maybe others will be added later on, just like we saw with the light side in terms of essentially Sora's piece being the only one left, but then you have these 7 lights from the past appear out of nowhere, so you never know what's going to happen with this chess game when it comes to Kingdom Hearts. So expanding on this, I had mentioned 2 out of the 6 other darknesses. Of course, one being connected to Vanitas and Ven, and the other one maybe actually it may be connected to Luxor, who seems to be connected to Quadratum or Virum Rex, and then the other 4 also being connected to these 4 characters from Yozora's world we're introduced to, and that may summarize all the 13 darknesses coming into play in this next arc, I guess the Master's arc, whatever you want to call it. And then, of course, again, as mentioned earlier, we have the 7 new crowns, or old new crowns. So there's definitely some overlap. I guess to kind of think about it, you have these darknesses that are probably connected to these characters in Yozora's world, but then they also have these characters from the Age of Fairy Tales that are residing within them that are actually warriors of light, or these lights that had been preserved in the black box. So we just have to wait and see how many white chess pieces come into play in the future games, and of course trying to see what direction Kingdom Hearts Dark Road will go. And again, if these 4 darknesses are associated 4 graves and the downfall of 4 of his classmates, and then also learning the identities of the other 7 upperclassmen, and what will be the fate of these characters, and of course the darkness that Xehanort will eventually have to learn to conquer and use, and the darkness that Xehanort decides to side with during his journey, and what led him to the whole big battle at the Keyblade Graveyard at the end of Kingdom Hearts 3. And for now, this is where I will leave off this theory. If you like this video, please like, comment, and share. Also hit that subscribe button, as I will release more theory videos as we get more Kingdom Hearts updates. Thank you for watching, and take care.